Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about St. Thomas Aquinas' relationship to the Greek philosopher Aristotle. I'll be using Joseph Peiper's book called Guide to Thomas Aquinas, published by Ignatius Press. Strongly recommend that you guys go ahead and buy this book and read it. It's an excellent book, and it covers basically the historical context of St. Thomas Aquinas, the intellectual and spiritual movements of the time, the role he played in the disputes of the time, and the shape that his thought took because of that. It's very much an introduction, so it doesn't get at length into the thought of St. Thomas himself, although it does get into it, but in terms of the general contours. So I did a video already kind of talking about Thomas's context, some of the ecclesial politics, some of the political movements of the time with the emperor and his relationship to the pope, etc. But now we're going to be talking about Thomas's relationship to Aristotle and Aristotle's relationship to the High Middle Ages. So we're just going to jump right into it and read certain quotes from the book itself. Hey, Alana, welcome. So we're going to read some quotes from the book itself, and then I'm going to comment on them, and we're going to make our way through several of these quotes. So opening with, we're on chapter 4 here. Again, you don't have to have seen the previous video I did on St. Thomas to watch this one. I'm trying to make each video its own thing. But please, if you're welcome to go and watch the first one I did on St. Thomas. So moving forward, Pieper tells us, and this is crucial. Here's the quote. The simple fact is that those who have dubbed Thomas with the epithet Aristotelian have not hit the mark. This is the reason why the first modern efforts to open up the world of St. Thomas, which date from about 1890, failed. Strong language there from Pieper. And he continues, yet they established an image of Thomas which prevailed for a long time, an image which has in fact prevailed to the present day. One of the first complete systematic accounts of St. Thomas's basic philosophical ideas, a book which serves as a text even now, bears the title Elementa Philosophiae Aristotelico-Thomisticae. So this is a work of philosophy that basically dubs Thomas as Aristotelian. I actually think I have this somewhere in my library. I have not read it, but I might have seen sections of it. But I think I found, this is actually an interesting story. I found it in my grandfather's library. My grandfather used to be a seminarian, decades ago. When was he a seminarian? It might have been before the council. I'm not sure. But anyway, I have the book. I think I could be wrong about that. But yeah, so I mean, this is pretty strong language, and I mean, I completely agree with him because we don't have people like Etienne Gilson popping up. We don't have people like I mean, much later than Gilson. You have Norris Clark. You have all these thinkers. Ulrich is one of them for sure, and we'll have to talk about him a lot more. But this discovery of the Neoplatonic element in Thomas, specifically coming through Dionysius and of course Augustine to an extent. And of course, there's all this talk of Thomas's existentialism, which Maritain's kind of part of that, but Gilson really is, I think, the big mover there. Thomas's existentialism, so existential Thomism, basically. The whole Neoplatonic element in Thomas was revived, and at first, however, we're talking about during the time of Leo the 13th, this encyclical Aeterni Patris to revive Thomism, that basically kind of started off on the wrong foot, it seems to me. But then you had these great minds who come along. So let's go ahead and continue reading Pieper here. Here's what he says in the bottom paragraph. To repeat, from a purely historical point of view, it is a misinterpretation of what really happened to imagine that young Thomas turned to Aristotelianism because it had become modish, or that he thus became an Aristotelian. This notion literally obstructed any real understanding of Thomas for decades. Again, strong language from Pieper here. until in recent years it was energetically pointed out that Plato too, Augustine too, the Neoplatonist Dionysius Areopagita too, are very much present and effective in the work of St. Thomas, and that Thomas himself was not unaware of their presence. Thomas frequently defends Plato against Aristotle. He points out that Aristotle, in his polemics, often did not consider the substance of what Plato said, the veritas occulta, hidden truth in Latin, but only the superficial phrasing, the sonus verborum, right? Kind of audible words, right? The superficial phrasing. I mean, this is so true. I mean, especially like the more I started to read Plato directly, but commentaries on Plato. I mean, David Schindler's book, the Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, kind of looms large here. That book I've used several times in some papers I wrote. And yeah, Aristotle, and I don't know why. There's been some talk about this among some philosophers, but Aristotle does seem to misrepresent Plato a lot. So Boethius has had his own project of trying to basically kind of marry Aristotle and Plato, which I think is a good idea. Of course, you have to be you can't whitewash the differences. But tangent, moving on. The doctrine of ideas, the conception of the creation as following prototypes living within the divine logos, this central Platonic concept was something that Thomas never abandoned, and a tally of the works of St. Thomas has turned up almost 1,700 quotations from Dionysius Areopagita. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of work has been done, recently on this. So, another paragraph from Peiper, which is worth reading before we move on, is as follows. This will astonish only those who regard intellectual history as a succession of isms that replace one another. But of course, it is not so. In the history of Western thought, Plato, for example, could never be displaced or replaced by Aristotle. In fact, the former was never an obstacle in the way of the latter. Gilson has convincingly demonstrated that, period. The Christian West's encounter with Plato, as it took form during the first millennium, was wholly different in structure from its encounter with Aristotle. The encounter with Plato was an encounter of two religious modes of thought, but the encounter with Aristotle was the encounter between religion and philosophy. That is a super important phrase there from Peiper, and undergirds so much of what we'll talk about, if not today, in a future video for sure, because it's really about this relationship between faith and reason, philosophy and theology, nature and grace, and all this kind of stuff. All the heated debates. But Thomas is right smack dab in the middle of this, right? And we'll see historically why in the Middle Ages, the threats, the dangers, the reactions, what we're dealing with really when it comes to Aristotle's introduction and the way in which he's introduced into the Middle Ages. Unlike with Plato, right, we have this kind of mystical philosophy that seeks to ground our world in the transcendent, and therefore the focus on transcendence and being and the forms is a kind of religious philosophy, right? And that encounters Christianity. But with Aristotle, right, we have a this worldliness, a much more natural, philosophical, reason-based, empirical, philosophizing that encounters this religious, transcendent tradition. In this case, embodied in what is called the kind of Augustinian framework, which is a bit of a generalization. So I hope you guys see that this is not so simple, right? Thomas is much more subtle than this kind of boxing him into another ism, right? As if the history of ideas was the history of ism boxes duking it out, right? Just not how things work. So more historical context here from Peiper on page 46. He says, the whole era the whole era of the Hohenstaufens, so this is the kind of political party, the emperor's family, it has been said, must be understood as a rebellion against the old Augustinian Cluniac doctrine of the inferiority of the natural world, that is, against contempt for the world. So isn't that interesting, right, that this kind of secular power is rebelling against this Augustinian Cluniac, right? So Cluny and the monastic order, Benedictines, of old old Europe. This rebellion, takes as its banner, of course, Aristotle and the university, which is, no longer the monastery as the center of studies, but now the university in the city, which studies Aristotle, which is the study of nature, right, and of empirical observation and philosophizing about nature, right. Another passage here from Pieper. He says, "We cannot say that older Christendom was identified absolutely with contempt for the world, right? It's much more rich than that. I mean, Augustine, of course, moves away from his Manichaeanism to become Christian, and you have all these beautiful passages in Augustine who, speaks of the goodness of creation, his commentary on Genesis, that God creates matter and that matter is good, all this kind of stuff, right? So fair enough. However, you don't have this kind of robust Aristotelian account of nature in Augustine because Aristotle, in the way in which he was introduced into the Middle Ages, hadn't been introduced in the time of Augustine. Augustine was dealing with the Platonists, with what's his name? Shoot, what's that Platonist's name that he debated often with? Was it Proclus, or no? It was another guy. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So Pieper continues, on the other hand, it is true that Albertus Magnus, a Swabian nobleman, was related by blood to the Hohenstaufens. And we have already mentioned that Thomas likewise was closely connected with Hohenstaufen circles through his father and brother, who were among the courtiers of Frederick II. So it is true that Thomas is connected to all this, and as was Albert. So this is Pieper, right? What Aristotle brought so vividly to light for the minds of those decades and what they primarily saw in his work was not so much natural reason as nature itself, the natural reality of the universe. So that's really kind of what the situation, what Aristotle is bringing to the table. So here on page 48, Pieper continues, what emerged in this early Aristotelianism was a completely elemental outburst of worldliness, antagonistic toward the spiritualistic symbolism which had hitherto governed the tone of Christian cosmology and biology. And as was very soon to become apparent, the worldliness was naturally linked with the peril of complete secularization. Isn't that interesting that it's, again, the Frederick II and his courtiers, right? You have this kind of secular power pushing for Aristotle, the city, the university, apart from the monastery, the Cluniac background, and the Augustinian, worldview. Again, so fraught with clashes here, intellectually, politically, etc. And so Pieper writes, sure enough, the charge of worldliness was soon raised by conservative Christians. Quote, they arrogated to themselves divine wisdom, although worldliness is far more native to their minds, end quote. So we may read in a polemic against Thomas and Albert. Ain't that interesting, right? They arrogated to themselves divine wisdom, although worldliness is far more native to their minds. This is an insult thrown at Thomas and Albert. Whereupon Thomas responded, and here's Thomas's response, they hold a plainly false opinion, who say that in regard to the truth of religion, it does not matter what a man thinks about the creation, so long as he has the correct opinion concerning God. An error concerning the creation ends as false thinking about God. Just perfect. Thank you, Thomas. Okay, so that's his response to that. Okay, so let's talk about Thomas's use of Aristotle. So here's a quote from Pieper, two quotes from Pieper on page 51. I do not deny that there are also a great many quotations from Aristotle and Thomas which are intended solely as ornament or even as confirmations of the saint's own exposition. By the way, let me just specify what I'm reading right here is added after the fact that Pieper is talking about all the times that Thomas agrees with Aristotle, quotes him, and shows him as reasonable. And he's also adding here in this quote that there's also times where Thomas quotes Aristotle for ornamentation. So what I don't want to get across here is that Pieper is saying, oh, Thomas only quotes Aristotle just for ornamentation and never agrees with him. That is absolutely not what Pieper is saying. There are whole pages on him basically saying the opposite of that, just to be clear, right? However, he says, there's a lot of times where it is ornamentation because of the genius of Aristotle and the authority of Aristotle. However, and this is why he brings this up, he never quotes Aristotle simply because Aristotle said something, as if he were an authority that would represent a kind of appeal for an argument to authority. So let me go ahead and read Pieper here. He says, I do not deny that there are also a great many quotations from Aristotle and Thomas, which are intended solely as ornaments, or even as confirmations of the saint's own exposition. But what I do venture to assert is this: Thomas never presents a quotation from Aristotle with the implication that the statement is valid because Aristotle made it. Thomas very often takes issue with some opinion of Aristotle's. He never assumed that the doctrine of Aristotle was invariably compatible with Christian doctrine. This attitude was quite prevalent among medieval Aristotelians. So that's important to know, right? We'll talk about Siger of Brabant and the Latin Averroism type stuff, but some people were quoting Aristotle as a Marxist would quote Marx as a final authority, and Thomas didn't do that. Continuing with Pieper here. Thomas himself was never of this number. We find him speaking of those who vainly endeavor to prove that Aristotle said nothing against the faith. That's a quote from Thomas. But above and beyond all that, as is well known, Thomas stated outright that the argument from authority is in itself, and quite generally, the weakest of all arguments. To attempt to prove something on the basis of authority is to prove nothing, he says. However, here's the next quote from Pieper, which adds context to this. Here's what he says. The argument from authority, Thomas says, is the weakest argument insofar as human knowledge is in question. Where its basis is divine revelation, it possesses supreme power. So you see how that's not at all like the Latin Averroists or like Siger of Brabant, right? And so Pieper continues. Thus, Thomas fully acknowledges the authority whose word is valid because it comes from this source, irrespective of whether we are able to check on its truth and validity. All true tradition leads back to this superhuman source. The traditum, what has been handed down, is valid because it ultimately derives from the word of God. So Thomas is not some secularizing pagan, basically, as the insult implied that I read earlier, to which Thomas beautifully responded. So I hope you see what Pieper's getting at here. So moving a little bit forward here, and this is the crux. So this quote here on page 55, this is the crux of what I'm trying to get at. And here's how it goes by Pieper here, page 55. The thing that is sought beyond Aristotle and Augustine as the matter that is really of interest, namely the truth of the objective world, is precisely what is embodied in Holy Scripture. That's Thomas right there. He looks at Augustine and he looks at Aristotle and he affirms, everything that he likes in both of them. Of course, he holds Augustine in high esteem because he's part of the tradition. But he shows how Aristotle is compatible if this worldliness of Aristotle is viewed as grounded on the theological claim of creation. So you see, he's playing this kind of paradoxical approach of affirming philosophy, reason, and nature based on a theological truth coming from divine revelation. And so here the point is that what's beyond both Aristotle and Augustine is this truth about the world that is embodied in sacred scripture. Of course, Thomas grounds all of this on what? You guessed it, the incarnation. The word was made flesh, right? The word he came into the world and revealed not only God, but the world, human beings, right? The nature of things, their purpose, their structure, right? And there's another book I'd like to do a video on, which is The Silence of St. Thomas by Pieper as well, where he talks about this doctrine of creation as central to the metaphysics and to the epistemology of Thomas, right? Reality being between two intellects, right? Ours, which discovers the real through our knowledge, and then God's, which causes the thing to be what it is through his knowledge. And so the thingness of things, the reality of things, the worldliness of the world, right, isn't between our encounter through our senses and our, abstraction and knowledge, and God's causation through his intellect, the divine ideas, all contained in the Logos. You see how, I mean, that's brilliant, right? You have both Aristotle's kind of this worldliness, but grounded in a kind of Platonic theory of forms, but with the Christian register in the Logos of God, the mind of God, in the doctrine of creation, but also of a word, a Logos made flesh. I mean, that is just brilliant and the basis of so much that we'll talk about. So let's move forward. So here, a few words about Thomas kind of dealing with Augustine and Aristotle almost in a ahistorical way. Now, this can sometimes be used as a criticism, but in this case, Pieper argues, and I think he's correct, that he does so precisely for historical reasons. So let me just read what Pieper says about the way Thomas reads and extracts in a kind of speculative register from Aristotle and Augustine, almost like taking their thoughts from out of their historical context and kind of making it his own in his historical context. So here's what Pieper says. Such dealing unhistorically with these writers is simultaneously the truly fruitful way to deal with them so that they affect living history. By such an approach, the impulse which motivated Augustine or Aristotle himself and continued to operate within him, Thomas, is kept alive. Whereas the purely historical approach forever runs the risk of removing the text or author under discussion from the realm of immediacy, from living intellectual timeliness, and consigning it or him to the realm of the museum of mere historical interest. Now, let me just pause here. I just want to recommend this fantastic book called Augustinianism and Modern Theology by Henry de Lubac, where he kind of shows how you have people like Cornelius Jansen or Baius who are reading Augustine, but in a superficial way that actually does violence to the deeper inner meaning and essence of Augustine's theology, unlike Thomas, who seems to be like just completely different from Augustine. But de Lubac shows beautifully how Thomas, in fact, grasps the essence of Augustinianism over and against these strict Augustinians like Baius and Jansen, or Jansenius, some people call him. And so that is a perfect example, right? It's not just about, what was the Latin terms that Pieper used? It's not just about the kind of outward appearance, but the hidden truth underneath, right? Can't find it, but you get the point. So here's an interesting point that Pieper makes, which is that the Middle Ages owes an immeasurable debt of gratitude to the Greeks. Everyone speaks of that. But the Greeks are likewise indebted to the Middle Ages, and no one speaks of that. Why? Because especially in Thomas, you have this preservation, this creative preservation of the Greek heritage in time, in the tradition, moving intellectual thought forward and preserving the Greek spirit in the synthesis of Catholicism. Right? Catholicism is this synthesis of Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem. So, moving on, another quote from Pieper. Thomas had a capacity for historical criticism. So here he's defending Thomas from this kind of accusation that he was basically this speculative, unhistorical, kind of naive person of back then. Now, it is true that the historical sciences were nothing like they became centuries later during that time. You have, for example, in the Summa and other places, Thomas quoting from certain letters that were later discovered to be inauthentic, right? I mean, historical criticism is something that develops after the High Middle Ages, of course, right? And of course, it has problems as well, and that would be another video. But here's Pieper defending Thomas. He says, in fact, Thomas had a capacity for historical criticism to an extent highly unusual among his contemporaries. That's interesting, right? That emerges more than once in his work. The Liber de Causis, so famous in the Middle Ages, was long considered a work of Aristotle's until Thomas, submitting it to literary criticism, discovered that it was in fact a compendium from Proclus. Consider also the mind of a man who, in the middle of the 13th century, could say of the then current astronomical theories, the fact that the phenomena can be explained in this way is no proof of the truth of these theories, for possibly the same phenomena might be explained in a wholly different way, as yet unknown to men. Secundum alium modum non dum ab hominibus comprehensum. A mind like this can scarcely be called uncritical. So he's defending Thomas. Let's continue. All right, a few more things about. We're going to talk a little bit about the university, the whole concept, the reality that emerges here at the High Middle Ages of the university, right? And then we'll talk more about Aristotle and close things out. So, okay, here's a quote from Peiper. There are two basic forms of knowing. On the one hand, knowing on the basis of kinship of nature, per connaturalitatem, as a man recognizes his beloved or what is his own. The stranger does not understand or misunderstands, but one who is allied with another in love and congeniality knows immediately and with absolute certainty what is meant in a fragment of a letter or a dimly heard call. And on the one hand, says Thomas, there is the conoscere per cognitionem, a knowing of what is alien, an abstract, conceptual, mediate knowledge of the mere object. So I had underlined this quote because I found it really good, because it shows that there's kind of what I was talking about with de Lubach's book on Augustine and the misreadings of Augustine by Jansen and Bias, right? Thomas understands this, that there's a difference between the outward appearance of the letters of the sentences and the hidden truth, the essence of the meaning and theology of a great thinker, right? Thomas understood this. Okay, let's talk about the university. So, what does the word mean, right? And here Pieper kind of goes off on this in a great, really helpful way. And so here's what he says. He says, in its sociological sense, the word denoted the assemblage, the union, the guild, the totality, the public, legal body of teachers and students, right? So the corporate body, right? But there's a second meaning, right? The second meaning likewise seems to have been in force very early. Universitas literarum, totality, comprehensive whole of the sciences, above all of the four faculties of theology, philosophy, jurisprudence, and medicine. So that's the origin, the kind of the origin of the word. First is sociological, right? The university just means the guild, right? The union, the corporate uh, body, right? With its own laws, right? But then it means, universal letters, right? University kind of means universal letters with theology, philosophy, law, and medicine. But then, of course, I might have skipped this. Nah, that's fine. I'll just keep reading. Page 61, another important quote that'll move us forward. Here's what Pieper says. From the beginning of the 13th century on, all the writings on theology and philosophy no longer came out of abbeys and monastic schools, although, of course, the old monastic orders still existed and now and then produced a masterful piece of work. On the whole, however, scholarly literature henceforth was created in the universities, and when the old monastic orders attempted to raise their studies to the level of the age, they had to leave the cloisters. This is so important historically, right, to frame all this. Here's another part here on the university. Pieper says, the University of Paris became the most representative of the medieval universities because, among other things, it was founded in the purest and most radical way upon those branches of knowledge which are universal by their own nature, i.e., theology and philosophy. No separate branch of knowledge formally poses the question, what is the character of reality as a whole? But theology and philosophy not only cannot dodge this question, they spring directly from it. So Paris here emerges with supremacy, right? Here's another section. He says, thus, it is not in the least surprising that the character of the Universitas Literarum was originally achieved in its pure form neither in Bologna, where jurisprudence was the central subject of studies and teaching, nor in Salerno, where medicine was foremost. Oxford, too, achieved that character only within limits, for from the beginning, empirical science and mathematics dominated there. In the case of Paris, however, we know that the 2 points around which the life of the university crystallized were theology and philosophy. And so Pieper concludes this chapter by saying the University of Paris in the 13th century then took the lead in philosophical and theological examination of the world, thereby achieving a sort of supremacy. Now, let's go back to Thomas. Let's go back to his choice, Aristotle and the mendicant order, biblical, evangelical, poverty movements, right? And therefore Augustine and scripture. But also, we talked about Plato through Dionysius and stuff like that. Here is the beginning of chapter 6. And let's get back to Thomas. Pieper writes, Thomas's decision was the outcome of a single unitary view of reality. And then further down, he had to provide good grounds for his fusion of an extremely theological, that is, biblical, theology, and an equally extreme philosophical philosophy. So here goes. Pieper writes on page 64. It may virtually be taken for granted that a revolutionary movement which had risen up out of criticism of the existing state of affairs, things cannot go on this way. This is a quote. Things cannot go on this way. More or less sums up the reaction of Dominic to the hopelessly sterile approach of official ecclesiastical circles to the Cathar and Albigensian movement in southern France. A movement there's so many like commas and parentheses. I hate when teachers do this, and yet I totally get it and I do it too. But let me reread the whole sentence so you guys can get the commas and the parentheses. So here's what Pieper writes. It may virtually be taken for granted that a revolutionary movement which had risen up out of criticism of the existing state of affairs, parenthesis, things cannot go on this way, more or less sums up the reaction of Dominic to the hopelessly sterile approach of official ecclesiastical circles to the Cathar and Albigensian movement in southern France, close parenthesis. A movement which aimed at changing the existing state of affairs would naturally not be greeted with joy by the powers representative of the existing order. And it might be anticipated that the antagonism would grow all the stronger as the revolutionary movement exerted an ever more potent spell upon the, quote, younger generation, which amazingly is what the mendicant orders did. Finally, in the normal course of events, such resistance takes on more strength as the ideal purity of the founders' first impulse vanishes or fades, is overwhelmed and distorted by, for example, fanaticism, or by professional revolutionaries, or by superficial fellow travelers who are impressed by what is faddishly outré. So let me go ahead and explain that last section. I know that's a mouthful, but bear with me. What he's saying here is because we're in a state of affairs that is so precarious, right? Working to synthesize and bring about peace, right, and a kind of deeper unity that moves forward more rationally and more effectively and more in conformity with the givens of revelation and reason, right? Uh, Negotiating such a unity and peace and intelligent path is going to, you know, be bumping up against people on both sides. And once you die, right, people after you are going to run with some of what you said in one direction or the other, usually because people after Thomas aren't Thomas. They're not as profound as Thomas. And so what happens is that this reform, this search for understanding this is basically something difficult. And so what happens is that you have people who become crazy, like the Latin Averroists started to cite Thomas, right, and which got Thomas's writings condemned by the Bishop of Paris, right? So you can't judge a thinker on his disciples immediately, right? You can't judge an event on its aftermath. Think ecumenical councils, right? Yeah, I'm not sure, Mark. I don't think it's dense, honestly. I just think there's a lot of commas. Um, yeah, maybe it's hard to understand. It seems to me that it's pretty straightforward, honestly. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. So here we have the page 67. Here's what Pieper writes. We learn from a polemic written by Thomas, one of the points which was apparently raised against the Dominicans' work of preaching the faith. This new type of preaching, the argument ran, exposed the bishops to the contempt of the people because the bishops did not preach that way. Ergo talis predicatio I can't do the R and the L. I used to pronounce it with my French accent, so you could do religiosorum, right? So ergo talis predicatio religiosorum periculosa est ecclesiae Dei. So therefore, such preaching by the mendicant friars is a danger to the Church of God. To which Thomas replies, no one should be hindered from doing something well just because others will be held in contempt because of him. Rather, those who make themselves worthy of contempt should be hindered. These are unusually harsh words. The struggle between the secular clergy and the mendicant friars was in full swing. So there you go. And this is important, right? Because you see this tension between the episcopacy and the priests of certain bishops, in parishes, and then the mendicant orders who are not part of that kind of structure. And then you have this clash between them, right? And even Thomas is using harsh language against the attacks, right? But the attacks go back and forth, and there is a lot on both sides. In fact, here's what Pieper says. He says, here, too, of course, right and wrong, sanctity and profanity were divided between both parties. In regard to violence, quote unquote, for example, we know that the Dominican scholars on occasion assaulted the rector of the university, who was a member of the secular clergy, and the superiors of the mendicant orders had repeatedly to remind the friars to display respect for the prelati ecclesiae, right? The prelates of the church. So tense times. Okay. And in conclusion, and then we'll move on to more Aristotle. In conclusion, these men, concludes Pieper here, Alexander of Hales, Albert the Great, Bonaventura, and Thomas, were the finest minds of the time. It was simply a fact that the avant-garde intelligentsia were gathering in the mendicant orders. So the future lay there, basically. And just to add to the intensity of the times, you have William of Saint-Amour, who writes this polemic poem. He kind of, I think it's him who, steps up in the middle of a lecture to cut off St. Thomas, or rather, someone else does and quotes William of Saint-Amour. So here's what Pieper writes: William of Saint-Amour's polemic was written on commission from the university and with the encouragement of the French episcopate. Its title was De Periculis Novissimorum Temporum, on the dangers of the last times. It was a witty pamphlet in which the author brought up all the objections which the official church had itself raised against the voluntary poverty movement 1 and 2 generations before. So the mendicants, Dominic and Francis, right? So, and here he concludes with, something must be done against these pseudo apostles whose appearance signalized the coming of the last days. The novissima tempora were intended eschatologically, and the pamphlet played upon all the age's anxieties concerning the last days. So they thought it was the end of the world, right? That sounds familiar. Okay, I'm going to skip forward because this whole middle section of the book will be for another video where we talk about the way in which Thomas writes and teaches, the method, his language, the Latin he uses. All of that's going to be in a future video. What kind of Latin does Thomas use? What is his way of teaching? How does he listen to others? How does he frame their objections? What is the structure of an article in the Summa? What is the structure of his disputed questions? What about his commentaries on Scripture? Why does he sometimes seem to be rather dry? If you compare him to Augustine, who's very poetic, that's going to make for the subject of a separate video. But let's skip ahead and talk more about Aristotle. The name Aristotle, writes Pieper, was meant to serve as a cryptic word for natural reality as a whole, for the visible, sense perceived world of physical material things, and within man himself, for sensuousness, for nature and naturalness, and also for the natural cognitive powers of reason, the lumen naturale. So before I keep reading Pieper here, I think this is important and very easy for us that are not in this context to miss. There's a very real kind of worldliness, a kind of reliance on political structures, on human reason in a seemingly hubristic way, right? As if there was this autonomy, right? That didn't need God, that didn't need revelation, almost like a denial of original sin, a kind of Pelagianism. I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? But there's like this idea of pure and separate reason being elevated is almost like a form of idolatry and felt kind of disgusting to the devout Christian of the time, right? There's a worldliness, like you're it's like you're out gambling, right? So it's hard to really perceive this from our perspective. So let me reread this whole quote here. The name Aristotle was meant to serve as a cryptic word for natural reality as a whole, for the visible, sense perceived world, the physical material things, and within man himself, for sensuousness, for nature and naturalness, and also for the natural cognitive powers of reason, the lumen naturale, right? The natural light. The other Q word, Bible, was meant to include the whole realm of the supernatural, the supra rationality of divine revelation, the reality of universe, man, and God, which is accessible only in faith, the gospel's doctrine of salvation as the norm of human life. So we can start to see here the compartmentalization and opposition of two different spheres. And this is incredibly important for literally the rest of our history up to 2025. So here's what Pieper says here on the next page. The danger of secularization in doctrine had made its appearance in unmistakable form. That is to say, reason was threatening to separate itself from faith, to declare its independence, and to reject all supra-rational and superhuman standards. This threat, moreover, was arising within Christendom itself. For example, in the circle around the Hohenstaufen Emperor Frederick II, with whose members Thomas was personally acquainted. Peter of Hibernia, which remember we talked about last time in sorry, I paused because I was checking the chat here. Sounds like Marxism's the idea you can achieve. Yeah, a perfect world utopia without God. That's right, Bob. It's exactly part. Marxism is downstream of this kind of compartmentalization and opposition, which ends up doing away with the supernatural. And one way to put this is that it immanentizes the transcendent, right? And so it becomes very much up to us to make this world into heaven. So before I keep reading the chat, let me go ahead and finish some of this, and I'll come back to the chat. Go ahead, feel free, guys, to put stuff in the chat, and I will definitely look at it. But I'll be back. Okay, so Peter of Hibernia. Remember we talked about this Irish teacher in Naples that taught Thomas, who was very much this kind of secularizing. Reason is a kind of goddess. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? But like this, trying to step away from the church and the Augustinian traditional view, right? Okay, so Peter of Hibernia, who had introduced Thomas to Aristotle while Thomas was a student at the Imperial University of Naples, was another representative of this tendency. Trends such as these, and Thomas had opened his mind to them with complete lack of bias, would not allow him to simplify the problem at hand in an unjustifiably naive manner. So Thomas had to take this seriously, is what Pieper is saying, right? He had to hear everybody out, right? And he had to kind of formulate what they were saying as best as possible. And then, in an unnaive way, but in a serious way, tackle this crisis, this intellectual crisis. And so here it comes to a front. Pieper writes, the danger of a division of intellectual life into what men knew on the one hand and what they believed on the other, a division so sharp that it would no longer be possible to maintain a bridge from the one realm to the other, had already become acute. Now, do we not know about this ourselves today, right? The privatization of religion and the radical separation of philosophy and reason, in our cases, a kind of reduction to the empirical sciences, right? This kind of reduction of reason that is meant for the public sphere. While any question about morality at this point, right, and natural law and reason, well, that kind of went out the window as well. But any question about religion is private belief, right? You believe what you need to believe. But in the public sphere, here are the rules of the game, right? And so this is, you can see the introduction of Aristotle creates this upheaval alongside this kind of decline of the, Cluny and monastic, old Europe stuff. So here is the kicker. Here is the kind of pinnacle of this episode that I wanted to reach, which is, what does Thomas do with this? What does Thomas do with Aristotle? And this is so important. Here's what Pieper writes, quote, "A legitimate union would mean two things. First, it would mean joining the two realms so that their distinctiveness and irreducibility, their relative autonomy, their intrinsic justification were seen and recognized." Philosophy. Here's me talking. Philosophy is not theology. Theology is not philosophy. Reason is not faith. Faith is not reason. Divine revelation is not sense experience, and our thinking through things. It's the word of God that we hear and then think through, right? So in a certain sense, you could say philosophy starts with our thought, while revelation starts with a word outside of our thought that we receive with our hearing, you could say, right? So again, we cannot collapse these into each other. So there's that first irreducibility, as Pieper puts it. Second, Pieper writes, it would mean making their unity, their compatibility, and the necessity for their conjunction apparent not from the point of view of either of the two members of the union, right? Neither simply from the point of view of faith, nor simply from that of reason, but by going back to a deeper root of both. And so by going deeper behind this distinction, he kind of like discovers the reality of their compatibility, which implies a whole that makes the parts specific to that whole. If you have a part that is taken apart from the whole, think of the analogy of water, right? Hydrogen is flammable, oxygen is flammable. You put them together in a molecular structure that makes water, H2O, and it's what puts out fires. Radically different. And yet, you cannot collapse hydrogen into oxygen and vice versa. But you see the unity, which is more deep and fundamental because it comes from the form, right? Which structures the molecule, is something that has an effect on the way we see the parts that is radically different, like almost black and white, fundamentally different from an element apart from a whole, right? And so this is what Thomas does. He goes behind all this. So 48 minutes. I need to wrap up. That's right. Yeah. Kind of, right? Um, someone commented, I feel like Pieper needs to say a hypostatic union of the two at this point. So analogically, right? But yeah, I mean, the Christological principle is everywhere. Yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead and read a few more and then we'll end. So Pieper writes, from the point of view of 13th century orthodoxy, and he means like, okay, what's the right way of thinking today? What's like a renegade way of thinking, right? Well, the renegade way of thinking is the whole Waldensian, Albigensian kind of radical rejection of the worldliness of the church and going off into schism and heresy, right? The other radical thing is Aristotle, which does the same thing, but on the flip side of the coin, right? I think of kind of like progressives or schismatic, kind of what we have today, right? But like the Aristotelians just want to run off and kind of secularize everything. So from the point of view, Pieper says, of 13th century orthodoxy, by which I mean the inevitably moderate climate of prevailing philosophical and theological ideas, the attitude of St. Thomas was aggressively unusual and disturbing. Wow, right? He says, for he accepted the opposing positions, both of them, in all their radicality, More than usual, his affirmation of the ideal of evangelical perfection was revolutionary. The more so since that ideal had arisen within the heretical Waldensian voluntary poverty movement, which all bien-pensants regarded with extreme suspicion. Bien-pensant is just a French expression that means kind of like, normal, people who thought, in a commonsensical way. And finally, Pieper writes, even more offensive was his resolute appeal to Aristotle. Despite all official warnings and bans, his fidelity to Aristotle was open and unbroken. Okay. Should I read these or not? I'm getting kind of running out of steam here. I'll end it here. Let me go ahead and just make some comments because I haven't really gotten into what he does exactly with Aristotle, which would mean that we'd have to talk about what Aristotle actually thinks in general, which is a feat. But I mean, it's possible to summarize, right? And then we have to look at what Thomas does in general with Aristotle. And I think that fundamentally it comes down to the category of creation. By introducing the doctrine of creation, which is a theological doctrine, by the way, into his appropriation of Aristotle, he radically changes Aristotle, but in such a way that doesn't destroy Aristotle. Think of it in terms of the famous quote from Chesterton, right? Chesterton, in his biography of St. Thomas, speaks of Thomas baptizing Aristotle. Think of what baptism is. Baptism is death to the old man and a new creation, right? A new life. So there's a bit of a paradox in baptism because there is a kind of destruction and new beginning, and yet there's also a continuity in nature. And I think that image that Chesterton gives us is honestly the best image. That's what Thomas does. Thomas puts Aristotle through the baptismal waters. He pulls him apart and reassembles him, right, as a Christian. But how? It's interesting that baptism is the analogy here because when we talk about baptism, we talk about we talk about new creation, right? Well, it's the category of creation that Thomas turns to because it's what we talked about with the real being between two intellects, the human intellect which receives the real on this end, and the divine intellect which actually causes the reality of the real on that end, right? And then looking at the relationship between God's intellect and things, and then things and our intellect, those two relationships right there is something Pieper goes into in his book on the Silence of St. Thomas, which is absolutely fantastic. But you see, what this does is it recasts things in a existential register because the whole idea of esse, of existence, being an act that is participated in by particular essences, which are an essence is a receptivity of the act of esse, which comes from God, right? This kind of establishes an existential mode of participation in being that is radically new, right? This kind of whole essence existence distinction of Thomas, but really the implications of it and the way in which it works is so profound. It's a pinnacle in the history of philosophy. And I can't wait to talk about what Ferdinand Ulrich does with it and how he uses it to respond to Heidegger and to Hegel specifically. But this is the exciting stuff. And that's why to say that Thomas Aquinas is an Aristotelian and to leave it at that is to completely misunderstand Thomas, Aristotle, history, and philosophy, right? Is to completely misunderstand what's going on. Is to completely misunderstand the historical circumstances of Thomas Aquinas, what he did, why he did it, and the way in which he did it, right? And so we have to understand that Aristotle and the Bible, and Augustine is on the side of the Bible here in this kind of dialectic, are two features that Thomas seeks to go beneath and beyond in order to, I'm talking about these movements, right? The Bible itself is the beneath and beyond for Thomas, right? But he finds their unity, the wholeness in which these two things become a part, or the Augustinian tradition and the Aristotelian novelty, right? And that is brilliant. But it also sets the stage for the West, for Occidentality, as Pieper calls it, for the distinction between reason and faith, revelation and philosophy, theology and philosophy, for the politics, right, and the church, right, and all of these features. And what you realize suddenly is that it's profoundly biblical and it's grounded. And to go back to what one of the commenters here put, right, you put, I feel like Pieper needs to say hypostatic union, right? This is all grounded in his idea that the word was made flesh. It's Christocentric, profoundly Christocentric. And that's why that's the summary of this video, right? That we have to understand Thomas's incorporation of Aristotle in a much more profound way. And we have to understand that the way in which he incorporates him, because of the doctrine of creation, gives it a structure of participation, of exitus reditus, right? That actually weds Plato and Aristotle together with Scripture and Augustine. It's a synthesis that is Christocentric. That's the genius that we're looking at, right? So I'm sorry if I kind of babbled through some of these quotes and I kind of didn't read them very well sometimes. So apologies, Mark up here. I kind of but Pieper's clear in the book. It's just that it's a long sentence. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But that was about Thomas and Aristotle. I'm going to be doing a video on the way in which Thomas writes and teaches. I'm going to talk about his Latin, and we're just going to get into the nitty gritty. If you guys haven't noticed, I'm doing a bit of a series here on St. Thomas. And then we can talk about, of course, I promised to talk about Ferdinand Ulrich, and we're going to talk about Etienne Gilson. And I mean, I really like Gilson. I've been reading a bit of him recently. But of course, as you can tell, I'm on a Pieper bender. I've gone through a lot of Pieper books, and I want to go through all the ones I have right now. You can kind of see them in the corner here. There's just ones on the virtues, and then an anthology right there. Anyway, what I love about Pieper's books is that they're easy to read, they're short, and they're profound, and they're clear. They're very Thomistic, right? They're very clear, insightful, not rigid, but not like, you know, they're not like relativistic and ambiguous, right? They're very crystal clear, but without constraining the intellect. I don't know. Pieper is just fantastic. I think we should always use Pieper in teaching. Period. Does Pieper talk about the powers of the soul by Thomas? Very likely. I don't know. I'll let you know. I'm about to read about the virtues, so he might. It's a good question, though. Does Pieper talk about the powers of the soul? I mean, in the philosophical act, which is tacked on to the end of Leisure, the basis of culture, he talks a little bit about the process of philosophizing, right? So maybe they're a little bit. And then Alana, thank you. Makes me want to read this book. You should definitely read it. It's very, very good. More Dominicans, do the virtues. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really good. And good to know, Chris. I wasn't sure how to pronounce your name, so there is such this a lot of information in such small piece of paper. I know, right? His books are. You're good, typo. Yeah, a lot of information in these small Pieper books. That's why I love him. I really recommend Pieper. Like if you want to get into St. Thomas, and if this is like your first time, Pieper will be extremely accessible. That I'm not saying he won't challenge you at times, but if you're stuck in a certain area, like that's okay. Like either, I would say at first just keep reading and then go back to what he said and reread that page, spend your time on it. You'd be surprised, sleep on it, come back the next day, and then it clicks. You just gotta be patient. But Pieper is, I think, the most accessible entry. And once you've made your way through some of Pieper's books on St. Thomas, then I think it's the best place to go to next would be Norris Clark's book, The One and the Many, which was revolutionary for me. So anyway, thanks everybody for watching. I hope that you got something out of this. I need to do some chores. I need to do some dishes. So make sure you make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell. Please consider, giving me like $1, $2, $5, anything to help me out. Because I don't get paid to read these books. That'd be nice. And you can go to the ecclesiablog.com if you want to sign up for a course I give. I meet with students every week for an hour on a semester-long course on various subjects. The two that I love teaching the most are ecclesiology. What is the church? Where does it come from? All that kind of stuff, right? And then Mariology, the church's teaching on the Blessed Virgin Mary. How does that make sense? I've been a bit disappointed in some areas of Catholic apologetics when it comes to Mary in response to Protestants. And so I'm trying to kind of make up for that. And I do have Patreon, Chris. It's patreon.com/the Logos Project. And God bless, Bob. Thanks a lot. All right. I'll see you guys next time. God bless.